Welcome to the podcast today, where we celebrate innovation for a happy planet. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. There are a few things that separate winning startups from those that crash. Some of them are pretty obvious: good leadership, a good market fit, sufficient cash on hand to grow. But you also need a good story. And that's not always easy for entrepreneurs to formulate, especially in an increasingly crowded field like climate or blue innovation, where big picture corporate missions are often overlapping. They all want to save the planet. Today we're going to speak with Alex Searle, a professional storyteller, about the craft of storytelling, why it matters, and what are the elements of a good story. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Good to be here.
I'm delighted to have you here. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the world of storytelling?
Yeah, it's an interesting, unlikely story. So I was born to musician parents who are artists and musicians, and they're still rocking at it to this day. And I've always had an interest in being creative and expressing myself. And so that culminated in studying English and journalism and media studies at varsity level. And then straight out of that, I got a job, pretty much one of the only jobs that I've ever held down, working with a company in the UK that provided sort of marketing and sales support for software and technology companies. And so that was an amazing crash course in not only learning how to communicate and how to understand how other businesses make a name for themselves with their customers and their audiences, but also a great crash course in business and sort of understanding how a business works. And so that inspired a drive to work for myself and to work with companies, which is the best way to do it rather than for them, at least in what I do. And since then, I've gone on to found 3 businesses. I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly sort of traveling around and finding new ways of how audiences are being built and how to build them, especially in a digital age, and doing, what I enjoy most, which is working directly with founders and executive teams and one-on-one with people, because that's where the greatest sort of sparks fly. It's been a fun journey, about 10 years or so.
There's a lot to unpack there. I think that's really great too, as a consultant and a mentor about storytelling, but you're also an entrepreneur. So you have a lot of street cred with your clients. You're not just coming in from a big company telling people about the importance of storytelling or how to build their startup. I'd love to get into that a little bit as well. When you first started working for this other company, what was the sort of motivation to jump ship and go out on your own?
Maybe I was a bit precocious to think this because I was about 24 and I thought, even though there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to get right in practice, especially, I kind of found that within those sort of 2 or 2.5 years that I was there, I pretty much was exposed to everything that I would likely be exposed to. So it's interesting when you feel like you're in an environment where you learn a lot, but then the pace of learning or the speed at which you're learning and you're being confronted with new opportunities and new challenges, when you burn the candle at both ends like that, you kind of reach the end more quickly as well. At least that was my experience. And so I thought that after a little while, I was keen to try it out. And if it didn't work out, fine, no problem. I'll always just go back and try something else. But I was keen at that point to try something else. And it turned out I was right. I was able to make it work. That was fun.
So let's dig in a little bit to some of the work you do with companies. Do companies come to you and say, we're working on our story, we're in a digital age now, we don't know where to start? How does this conversation start with a new client?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes I'm approached, which is great. I'm always very humbled. It's always nice when somebody kind of taps you on the shoulder and they come with an interesting project or they've got a great team and, they're wanting to get better at what they do. And more often than not, when it comes to those sorts of approaches, a lot of the time the founders or the directors are kind of doing a lot of the right things correctly already. So it's good to go into an environment where they're open to learn and do better. Sometimes it's me actually approaching somebody else or, I go, I really like what you're doing, and I'm not looking for a job, but it's nice just to have a coffee or a virtual coffee and to just approach people and talk to them about what they do and I did that actually for quite a while. I often used to just approach people out the blue, whether it was on LinkedIn or Facebook, or sometimes just send them a cold email. I used to really get a kick out of just seeing where this one goes, especially if it was a project or they were doing some work that was interesting. Perhaps it was in biotechnology or cryptocurrency or in travel data analytics or whatever. I'm a constant sort of information addict. I love just being in a room full of people who are 500 times smarter than I am and just downloading. And if it means I pick up the tab for a couple of coffees, I'm really happy with that. That's a bargain. And so sometimes in that, the back and forth of the conversation, something arises, something happens. I think often they like the way I ask dumb questions because they're dumb and because they're not always at the level that maybe they're used to taking. And so sometimes it's about having the simple questions being pitched to you where, you need to kind of understand the basics, like what's the foundation of your brand, or who buys from you, or what is the story that you tell your customers right now, today. And so sometimes with those sort of short staccato questions, you get interesting and sometimes not completely formed answers. And often that then turns into, a piece of work that we jump into together. So it's always organic, which is fun.
That's really interesting. And it's a perfect segue into this conversation about storytelling, and it's important. So
yeah.
Does storytelling really start with these fundamental things? Is it really about bringing it down to its essence?
Yeah, absolutely.
What for you is storytelling?
Firstly, I think it's worth maybe dispelling, what storytelling is and exactly how we're choosing to use it in this context. Because I know often people will hear it and they'll think of, fairies and princesses turn into pumpkins and all sorts of other good stuff. Or worse yet, it's something that feels fluffy and extraneous and unnecessary, something that marketing does on a Friday. But really, it's the foundation of any successful business. It really is. Good stories allow businesses to become brands, but you need a brand to build a business. I think people understand that. But first, you need a story to build that audience. And there's a number of different ways to do it. You also have different companies that maybe take the lead in different departments in creating that story. But I think it's always worthwhile as we're looking at storytelling through the lens of something that is actually essential to human activity. Since we were able to start forming basic grunts as cavemen, we've been using that to tell stories, to tell people in our tribe that there's predators nearby, or to communicate essential information, or whatever the case may be. So we've been doing it for a while. And because we've been doing it for so long, we're actually really good at telling stories. Even people whom you might think aren't, sophisticated or obviously polished storytellers, we do it every day as a matter of survival. As a result, I think we're also, not only have we honed an ability to tell stories, but we've also honed an ability to listen to them and to be aware of the general arc of a story, who's involved, what happens, why I should be caring in what you're saying, and so on. And so when you understand the roots of, why it matters and why we tell stories to each other, it's a lot easier then to justify that in the context of any business, whether they're in conservation or, whether they sell lemonade. It's ultimately the same kinds of things that they're leveraging. And I find, personally for me, very compelling, especially when it comes to when businesses or, startups are working in complex environments. And so what I mean by that is an environment where there's more to tell, there's more to digress than just the story, of Jack and Jill went up the hill. But there's information to be explained, often to be simplified or distilled, and then also for that to be retained to the point where somebody in your audience now needs to take action or to feel inspired by that. And so that for me is often where I kind of do a lot of the work with companies where they work in a complex environment or they have a complex product. And that's when the storytelling becomes a tactical kind of game, if you like, where there's a few sort of specific tools that you can use to just make the delivery better and make the story stick.
What are the key elements of a good story for a company today? Or maybe that's eternally. Those key elements are always the same.
It's a funny thing because there's, like any great sector or discipline, there's certain constant truths that are always there. And there are other things that get updated in a shorter to midterm where, new trends, whether it might be through technology or the way people talk or how they leave messages or whatever the case may be, that often is worth incorporating as well. There's a couple key hallmarks that I think should be in every story, or at least, sharpening up your story, because you might already have one. You might already be doing something that is working or partially working, but there's a few things that if you go down the checklist, it could be made a lot better or elevated to the stage it should be. So I'd say the first thing is keep it short, keeping it brief, keeping it clear and simple, because when it's simple and clear, it's easier for somebody to pick up the relevance of what you're saying and why it matters. Also, in this day and age, you've got to have something that stops the scroll, something that is going to kind of arrest people in the daily, saturation of information that absolutely all of us are subjected to. So if you're short and you're clear and you're concise and your messaging and the feel of the messaging takes that kind of form as well, that's a good place to start. Another kind of area is to make it easy and make it about the people that you've helped. So don't make it about only you. Or as my mother-in-law says, don't be an I specialist. I, me. I wonder why she says that to me. But, you've got to be able to talk in such a way that makes it feel and makes it seem like you have helped other people who are like your audience. And I think that's a key thing. That sort of always goes back to that thing about why people buy from people and they want to do business with people and not buying a product. And that's because of the relationship and the rapport that's struck up in those opening moments. So the more that you can make it easily, remove the friction and make it something that centers around people like your audience and how it benefits them, that's key. Another area is to make sure you're not selling. And I think that this is a deceptive one because...
Very hard one.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Because it's easy to say don't sell or don't make it salesy. At the same time, though, we wouldn't be in business if we didn't have something to sell. So you can't beat up on that. And, going back to our caveman example, there's always something transactional in communication anyway. So there's nothing sleazy or to be avoided, but rather it's about how it's managed and how it's positioned. Because ultimately, it's also about what you're selling. If you're selling vacuum cleaners, the way not to go about it is to go in and say, hey, do you need a new vacuum cleaner? Really, what you want to be talking about is the value of that you put on a clean house and what that means for the rest of your livelihood. So it's about approaching it at that level where it's a lot less like selling, but really you're working on the level of ideas. And that's where the best stories are. Those are where the most memorable ones reside, and those are the ones that cut through. So when I say don't sell, what you want to replace that with is a sense of problem solving and being able to tell a story at the level of ideas. I suppose another one, and then I can pause there if you like, is finding a level of consistency in the way that you tell a story. So perhaps this is a bit more of a practical one, but we live in a world where we're absolutely chock-a-block with different mediums. We've got podcasts and articles and features. We've got LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook. We've got long form, short form. We've got videos, so you're really sort of spoiled for choice in the medium. And I think that often what companies do, especially startups, is this need to do everything and to just flood the channels with everything at every angle in every direction. And I'd say that that's probably one of the worst things you can do because you're firstly spreading yourself too thinly, and you'll need a whole media team to do that, at least properly. And the second thing is that you're not giving yourself a chance to kind of embrace a medium and to find a way to tell a story that's going to resonate with you first, because that's where the mastery comes in, right? And that's why if you think about your favorite podcast, your favorite books, authors, you read them not because I like podcasts, but you listen to it or you read it because you enjoy what they have to say. And there's a mastery going on in the level of communication and the way that those ideas go out. And so that's what anybody who's really wanting to take storytelling seriously needs to have a little bit of time to find that right medium, to find the format that they gravitate themselves to or that fits their story best, and then just go for that. Do that one thing, even if it's one particular type of platform with one format, a certain time every week, and then just sticking to that for a year. You will see what happens if you are absolutely rock solid consistent on that.
I think that's really brilliant advice because I think it's a very slippery slope. We're all connected through all these different mediums like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, but they're all really nuanced in how they handle the information that you're putting out there and how people react to it and what people want on those different mediums. And I think it is a challenge to figure out how to tailor your story to those different mediums, or maybe not tailor your story, but tailor the way you're communicating it. So I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
After a short break, we'll hear more about tailoring your business's story to different audiences and hone in on advice for mission-driven startups. A big thanks to the Maine Technology Institute, MTI, investing in innovation for a prosperous Maine. MTI is Maine's unique public-private partnership whose core mission is to diversify and grow Maine's economy by accelerating innovation in the state's targeted technology sectors. MTI offers grants, loans, equity investments, and services to support Maine entrepreneurs and organizations as they transform their innovative ideas into new products, services, and companies, leading to the creation of quality jobs for Maine people. For more information about MTI and its programs, please visit mainetechnology.org. For a blue economy to thrive, people need to use more sustainable products. But which products? And will consumers actually adopt them? Innovators like you are hustling to figure this out. Spark number 9 can tell you if there's demand for your product. Spark markets your product before it's built using online advertising so you launch smarter. Have a big idea? Vet it with Spark before you build. Visit Spark online at www.sparkno9.com or find them on LinkedIn.
We're back with Happy Planet. We just talked about telling your story through different mediums. So a lot of our listeners are going to be new businesses, new funds, and they have very different audiences. Startup A has to raise money. They have a product to sell. They're trying to build their global brand to just general people. How do you take that one kernel of a story, that one story that's your core, and how do you adapt it, or do you adapt it to these different audiences?
It's a great question. And what's fun about it is that no two approaches are the same. So like many great things, you have certain tactics and you have certain strategies that you go into that will make, for it to be a better journey. But the journey itself is unpredictable, dependent on the kinds of people you're dealing with, the openness for people to embrace these new mediums and so on. For me, it always starts with good questions, because good questions have the ability to make people really think about the answer, not only the answer that they should be giving, but the current answer that they have. Because we all do that, right? We all sort of version control our answers sometimes. We sometimes do that as if it was a Google Doc. It's kind of, here's V1 and V2. And in a young business or a startup, that's often something that changes. And there's good reasons why that is. Having good questions like, who is your audience made up of? What is the one particular thing that you do that they are not able to get from anywhere else? Another question could be that I often ask is, if there was a particular insight that you shared with your audience, which helps to characterize the experience of working with you, what is that insight and why can't they find that somewhere else? So, questions like that. And often they're context specific, but that often helps to kind of get some of the juices flowing. And often, interestingly enough, in the kind of the broken answers that you get from that and the discussion that happens after that, you really find yourself kind of picking a couple gems that come from that, because it's when you move away from the corporate identity model of storytelling, this is our audience and our track record of 25 years and that kind of stuff that I don't think anybody's really impressed with anymore, but rather digging into actual insights that people really do genuinely feel and drives them, every day to get out of bed and to continue working on this one piece of technology that they're trying to get off the ground. What is that? Talk to me about that.
Right. And is that message different when you talk to your investor and when you talk to your client?
Yes, it is. I think the substance of the message and the content that informs it is the same, because otherwise you might need to go see a doctor. But ultimately, yes, it's something that I think should be tweaked. And I think there's maybe one or two old school schools of thought when it comes to, having one mission statement, one version of who you are, and that's it, and you don't waver from that, and we're going to die on the hill about it. But there's nothing wrong with splitting that and kind of tweaking it based on who you're speaking to. We all do that anyway in our day-to-day communication, and we do that because we want maximum effect for what we're saying. And so I think that the second thing, interestingly enough, that I do after asking questions is to encourage people to think about their audience in tiers, so in different layers. It's easy just to see everyone in front of you as one big gray blob, right? And they're just sort of people over there that I've got to speak to. But especially when you're speaking to people online and you may never have a chance to meet them, we're all different, right? And we all ingest information differently. And so why not try to make that as sort of a targeted and bespoke kind of approach as possible? So I'd say that having different versions, if you like, of answers to those questions. What is it that you do? What is it that no one else can do? What is the insight that you're sharing with people, and why does it matter? It's good to work on that in different ways and to really sort of picture the different key members of your audience in front of you when you're kind of coming up with those elements of your story.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because I think they're just looking for different information at the end. So it's not about being duplicitous, it's being helpful and trying to communicate the same message in a way that is most helpful to your audience.
In many ways, I think you see the greatest showcase of exactly this in pitch decks. And a pitch deck is an interesting beast, isn't it? It is this gold standard. Once again, it's the medium where if you're not able to make a functioning pitch deck, then you really got to go back to the drawing board. And I think with pitch decks, there you're kind of really altering and tweaking the ingredients of your soup as much as possible for somebody to really, from the first slide, wow, okay, this is interesting. Where is this going? And that's all about storytelling, because you can have a great solution, you can have a great product, and obviously that's something you need anyway. But the point is that in something like a pitch deck, when you've got that medium, if you're not kind of winning people over within the first 3 slides, or really kind of diving into something compelling within those first 3 slides, that's always a big tick in the box for me, first 3 slides, then it's worth re-looking at things. Pitch decks are fun.
Well, we all know that the best technologies don't always win, and the difference may very well be their story.
Yeah, it's a good way to see it.
I want to talk specifically about something that I think affects most of my listeners and the specific audience in the mission-driven companies. Many of the startups that I'm working with, they're all talking about the UN sustainability goals. Many of them are climate focused. It's becoming a crowded field if you're an entrepreneur. And if you're a climate-related entrepreneur, how do you differentiate yourself? Like, how does your story, everybody's evoking the same standards. How do you stand out in that field and not just sound like you're just spitting back the UN's, sustainability goals, which are wonderful, by the way. I'm not knocking the goals. I'm just wondering, if you're a startup, are there ways you recommend of differentiating yourself from this crowd that is increasingly noisy? I mean, I'm delighted it's noisy, but what do you think?
I think the first 2 things to remember or to consider when you're in this field is that it's no longer something where you can leave out your online or your digital component. I think that in a way there's maybe some bitter enders who think that kind of having an analog pitch deck or something that maybe doesn't belong in the 21st century can fly. I think that's not the case, and you really do need to have a digitally savvy, approach to what you do. So that's the first fairly obvious thing. The second is that you're really spoiled for choice when it comes to the content of what you're dealing with. I suppose, going back to Ocean Innovation, we were dealing with startups who were working in the blue economy and in the ocean space. And you've got something so evocative, the material, if you think about it, where we all clearly, pretty much all of us, care about the sustainability of the planet, about the sustainability of resources. And so there's a common thread there that I think everybody can easily tune into. The issue is that you've got a common thread that everybody can tune into, and everyone does, right? So the saturation sort of element there tends to be bigger, which means you've got to reach further in order to stand out. It's not enough just to say we're committed to making the ocean a cleaner, more sustainable place. It has to be more imaginative and a few steps out of that concentric circle, if you like, for it to hit the mark. And I'd say that there are 2 things that startups can kind of think about when it comes to making their messaging just pierce through a little bit more. The first is that I always try and encourage the people I work with to really go for radical simplicity. So it's easy to, hoodwink your audience into thinking that you've got the best mousetrap or the most efficient biofouling agent or whatever the case may be, because of all of the research you've done and all of the gobbledygook that you're adding into your product description, right? That might work. It might even make your product better, but essentially it's not going to cut through. And so I think often in the world that people often work in, especially if it is these sort of more technical applications of problem solving and there's a technology component to what they do, there's often this tendency to kind of fold your arms and to think that, well, what we do is complex. There's a certain level of sophistication here, and that's kind of just how it is. You've got to upskill yourself. Sorry, Mr. Customer, or sorry, Mr. Investor. you've got to just do the work. And, one day when you get to our level, give me a call, and then you can invest in my company. Now, obviously, I'm dramatizing that slightly, but at the same time, I have seen a lot of that where there's just a general, like I say, a folding of the arms. And it's not my fault you're stupid. You've kind of got to get onto my level. And really, that's where the radical simplicity part has to really be turned on its head, and very quickly. Because aside from being arrogant and unhelpful, you've got to be doing in the work to be able to create the understanding in the market that should be there. And the fact that it isn't there isn't your customer's fault. It isn't your fault, to be sure, but it is an opportunity for you to be able to lay that groundwork so that the areas of complexity that somebody might see elsewhere in the market isn't there when they come to you. And that is immediately a differentiator. That's immediately a breath of fresh air because, great. From the word go on your website or perhaps on your pitch deck, I understand what you guys do. I understand how your product works. I get the mission. I get who's behind it. It all makes sense, because you've taken the time to be as simple and as transparent and as direct as possible.
It's generous in a way. There's a certain generosity behind it because, it feels kind when people's messages are clear and simple, but it's generous with other people's time. It's like, we're not trying to make you work to stay longer on our page. Yep. I really like that radical simplicity.
There's this notion that complex challenges should have complex solutions at their heart. And I think that that's just a bad idea, right? I don't buy that for a second. But if you have a genuinely difficult challenge, just because it's complex doesn't mean it has to be complicated. Embracing simplicity means it's easier to understand, it's easier to set apart. There's less selling required once going back to selling, right? Because it makes sense what you do, the insight you approach it with, and how it fits into solving that challenge in their world. Radical simplicity, I think, doesn't have to involve only marketing or sales, if you like, but across the whole organization. It's a value. It's a purpose-driven thing that I think should be embraced from top down.
That's wonderful.
So the other thing in a way is I think that you're also dealing with the fact that we all exist in the age of hyper distraction and absolute, like we said, saturation of information, but also the distraction part, I think, is the real enemy here. Because when you've got more on the go, you're more easily distracted. And so if I'm going to be reading through your site, or if I want to be able to listen to a podcast about the mission that you have in your business, it's going to be so easy for me to get distracted 30, 40, 50 times during downloading that information. And so something else that I encourage a lot of the time in storytelling is being bold and different, and often just comes down to being really as creative as you'll allow in being able to interrupt that distraction. I think oftentimes there's this idea that you've got to keep somebody's attention, but that's impossible because we live in a digital age and we've got the sort of the TikTok length attention span nowadays, don't we? So really what you've got to do is rely on the fact that you are going to lose somebody's attention across the time that it takes for them to read a paragraph or to listen to a podcast. But if you offer enough moments where you can bring them back. You have
to win them back. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't mean that you have to do something crazy every time to do that. Sometimes it can just be little micro moments. Perhaps there's, in a podcast, maybe put a little bit of music, or perhaps change the topic here, or reverse the roles and get the host to kind of sit in the hot seat. Or there's actually many, many different ways to do it in pitch decks as well, when you've got to interrupt that same motion of slide by slide by slide, but just change it up, make it interesting. So when you make it interesting and you make certain creative or bold leaps in trying to make it different, what you're really doing is not just making it different for the sake of it, but you're interrupting that distraction. You're probably going to get to a point where somebody might have fallen asleep, literally or figuratively. And at that point, it's going to bring them back in.
How helpful is a device like humor?
Great. Extremely helpful. Yeah. I wish I had a joke at this point to kind of illustrate that.
I know. We got to win my audience back.
I think especially it's once again, humor is always contextual, and humor is always going to be, who you're in front of at the time on the day. I would say if you had to have a hard and fast rule, it's better to employ humor if you are in some kind of face-to-face situation. So I wouldn't, put a big fat sort of an Irishman and a priest sort of joke at the bottom of your pitch deck. I'd rather, maybe save that one for when we're in person, or perhaps when we're on Zoom. But humor's great. If you've got the rapport, do it.
So you yourself are an entrepreneur. I love to ask people on this podcast what their advice is to other entrepreneurs. So I'm going to ask you to give advice outside of the realm of storytelling, but is there something else that you think is a really critical piece of advice that you could offer our listeners?
You know, the commitment and the drive, that first kind of instinctive passion that you feel to do something to make a difference, whether you're trying to have a more sustainable approach to fish farming or to arrest some of the stuff that's going on in the Amazon, whatever you might be doing, you know, that first kind of need to do that. And I think entrepreneurs will feel that, you know, there's a need to do it. You're compelled to do what you want to do. You have to let that shine as much as possible. And there's different ways to do it. And perhaps there's another podcast that we can dedicate at another stage to let that shine, not only in your story, but in the way that you write down to the product that you develop, to, you know, the way that you pitch it, you know, everything else. It's don't skimp on the commitment part. Don't skimp on the drive part, because that's something that people always see. It's always the first thing that they connect with, and it's the last thing that they remember. Everything else in the middle is detail. But if you're not that kind of absolutely fizzing and popping, explosive, walking and talking kind of container for that energy, and if you're not carrying that, somebody else has to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is maybe more of a practical thing, which is make it easy for people to get involved.
That's great advice.
I think I see this often where I've been presented with an amazing pitch deck, or, you know, speak to an incredible entrepreneur, or, you know, just blown away by a story that I've read about somebody. And at the end of it, it just kind of ends there. And I've got my fork and my knife in my hand and I'm ready to go, but there's no entree. And so the invitation to participate, the next step, some people call it a call to action, but that's a little bit, you know, hack and vague. But really, the what do I do now element, I think, is something. It doesn't necessarily need a sophisticated or a complicated answer. You know, if you're interested, if you like what you're reading, if you want to get involved, if you want to participate, if you want to help us with what we're doing, click here, fill out this form, tell me what to do, where to go. It might be obvious to you, but a lot of the time it's not for your audience. So just make it clear, make it idiot proof.
That's great.
Make it easy for me to get involved.
And if people want help with their stories, alex-searle.com. We'll have the website in our show notes. I really loved having the opportunity to speak to Alex today about storytelling. After all, I started this podcast because in my own business, I had learned the importance of a good story. And I wanted to tell entrepreneurship stories here that I felt were interesting and deserving of an extra boost. I'm also going to take some of Alex's advice to heart. Hopefully it'll improve my own storytelling. This was a different type of podcast for us, more of a toolbox episode. Let me know what you think. Thank you for listening. Please follow Happy Planet wherever you listen and leave us a rating and review. It really helps new listeners discover the show. Happy Planet was reported and hosted by me. I am also the executive producer. The talented Dylan Hoyer is our producer and editor. Composer George Brandel Egloff created our theme music. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetpodcast.com.